Welcome to another episode of Dr. Kamini Rao's Masterclass. Another guest, another episode. What's so special about this guest? He's a doctor? Yes, of course. I'm very happy to say yes, he's a doctor. But is he only a doctor? No. He's an advocacy specialist for what? For public policy and also for training in rural populations, particularly the tribals. And therefore, can you imagine a doctor training tribal population, building institutions, public advocacies, changing policies, and all rolled up in one, and that too in HD Kote, in Bandipur, where all the wild animals are there. So let's go and meet this unique person, Dr. R. Balu or Balasubramaniam. Welcome to the masterclass, and I am delighted to say that we are all happy, and my viewers, to know more about you, because here is a person who is a doctor and yet you went into the tribal areas. So can I know a little bit of your background? Balu, may I call you Balu?
Absolutely.
So Balu, just tell me about your background.
You know, coming from a typical middle class family, born and brought up in Bangalore, typical middle class aspirations. And for people like me with siblings already abroad, it just meant that you become a doctor or an engineer and then you sort of follow their footsteps. So I was wanting to always get into IIT, and that was those days we had this correspondence courses, brilliant tutorials, Agarwal tutorials and stuff like that. But I didn't qualify, so I was very disappointed. I thought let me get into engineering. Specifically, I wanted to get into computer sciences. I had got a very good percentage in my PUC. I had 99.67%, so I thought I could
Oh my God.
get into any college in engineering. I learned my lesson a little later when at those days they were called as RECs. They were not called NITs like today. So I wanted to get into REC Surathkal, which had just introduced computer science as a program. And only one seat was available for general merit, and somebody with 100% had got qualified. So I was waitlisted one, obviously very disappointed, and I realized that I'll just take any college that I get now. It doesn't matter now. If I didn't get into the institutions I wanted to be in, I'll just take what comes my way. And I chose to get into BMS College
Okay.
in Bangalore, because those days my parents were very clear that they couldn't afford me going into a hostel, so they said it has to be in the city of Bangalore. So I chose BMS College. First day I went, I was ragged very badly. We didn't have an anti-ragging law those days. And I never had the courage to go back to college the next day. But at the same time, my mothers are always very intelligent. So I couldn't come home and stay at home all the time, because she would figure out that I'm not going to class. Neither did I have the money to go sit in a movie theater. So only option was coming back from college. I noticed in Gandhi Bazaar the Ramakrishna Ashram.
Yes.
Beautiful campus, gates were open. I thought, let me just spend some time sitting there. 1 or 2 days I just went there, sat there, walked around the ashram. I think the people there, the brahmacharis, the monks must have thought some young vagabond, maybe he's come to steal fruits. So just to look serious and to make them believe that I'm a very serious contender for spiritual growth, I went and sat in their library, which is near the gate, the Bangalore Ramakrishna Mission's library. And the next 2 months changed my life. I virtually read everything that Swami Vivekananda wrote. There were 8 volumes then, complete works of Swami Vivekananda. But more importantly, 2 books changed my life. One was called His Call to the Nation, and the other was called To the Youth of India. And at 17, a very impressionable age, when Vivekananda's message is read, you don't really understand much, but then you're inspired to be something different, to make a difference. And coincidentally, I still remember around September 28th or 29th, I was extremely inspired by statements of his like, I do not believe in a God or religion which cannot wipe away the widow's tears or bring a piece of bread to the orphan's mouth. Or statements like, I call every young man a traitor who, having been educated at people's expense, pays not the least heed to them. So I told myself, if I get a chance in my life, this is what national service is going to mean to me. This is what is going to be the celebration of Swami Vivekananda's message for me. And I come home, coincidentally I had a telegram saying, join Mysore Medical College immediately. as a PCMB student, you obviously apply for all colleges, right? And I just, and I never wanted to be a doctor, I never aspired to be one. But I saw this as a divine sign. I still believe it is one. I thought it's a way Vivekananda was telling me what to do. And I was 2 months late to my preclinical course, but I still went to Mysore, joined medicine. That was 1982, a long time ago. But once you understand Vivekananda, you can't sit quiet. No, he himself says, I enter into one pore of your body, and then my message will run right through you till you work. And 84, I said, I have to do something. And that's when, as a third year student, 19 years age, not knowing what I'm getting into or setting out to, inspiration coming from Vivekananda, being a young man, I wanted this to be a national movement. So that's how the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement was born.
So when you say that you created this movement, was it a kind of society you created, or was it a kind of a proprietary concern, or was it a public platform? What do you mean by movement?
No, it would even be wrong to say I created anything. I would look at it as I was an instrument through which things happened. I still believe that way. Incidentally, it happened through me, and I'm privileged that people recognize me as the founder, but I think it's Vivekananda's work in action. It was legally, it was registered as under the Societies Act. It's a society. It's typically what today is called an NGO. Those days I never even knew that those such organizations called NGOs. More than as young doctors, students, classmates, people who joined medicine later on, I invited them to become members, and that's how it grew. Today we have people from IITs, different youngsters who really want to make a difference joining us, and more than 800 people work full time.
800?
Yeah, across the state of Karnataka.
So how does one apply to this organization?
As a member, once you hear about us, people send me an email or write to us. An existing member recommends their name, because we have our own kinds of approach. We believe that we, having started off as doctors and seen the influence of alcohol on rural economies, we made rules for ourselves and said we won't smoke, we won't drink. And so we ask people to subscribe to that, and we say we should have nationalistic aspirations. You must be willing to serve this country in whatever way. You could be a very successful doctor in the city of Bangalore or Mysore, but you should only believe that you got to serve. So your primacy of social intent is something important for us. So we invite them. Membership is by invitation, and then people join, and some of them continue, some of them don't. Many of them make it their lifetime aspiration. So we had several young doctors who stayed on, including people like my wife. So they just come and they decide this is their life.
So your wife by choice came in and then the marriage took place, or was it the other way around? That
she joined the organization as a member. She was 5 years my junior, so I never even met her as a student. But the youth movement had taken roots in the Mysore Medical College already, and so a lot of young people would join as members, and she was one of them. And she also came there for the internship. We were also recognized as a center for rural training, so interns from Mysore Medical College, JSS Medical College would come there. And she was one of them, and so she said, this is my life's calling too, and so we just decided to get married.
Is she a gynecologist?
She did her MD OBG from KEM Hospital, Mumbai.
Okay. So there is...
she went to do her OBG because we felt that this is too MBBS.
Maybe a difficult
and understanding reproductive child health work, and the importance of safe motherhood. She wanted to be a surgeon. She even today tells me, I wanted to be a surgeon because you convinced me that this is more important work. So she did very well in national entrance, so she went to Mumbai.
But that's a good college also that she went to anyway. But having said this, if I look back at your early life, here was a person who was so acutely interested in doing computer science, didn't get computer science, so you really didn't feel bad about it. So failures in a way are stepping stones to success. So therefore there was a purpose for you not to get into REC Surathkal, and then the BMS college, and then the ragging was another way to tell you, okay, change direction, and then a telegram coming and say get into medicine, and medicine was never in your mind. But then I keep wondering, you just did MBBS, and then after that you created a full movement. I mean, how many doctors at such a young age of 19 would think of really creating a movement like this and having almost 800 people following this movement? And building big institutions. I mean, people may have a lot of ideas, but armchair politicians, there are many. But people who will sort of say, I will do it, and actually do it, are very few, maybe 0.1 or 0.01%. And so I would like to ask you, yes, Swami Vivekananda going across to the center in Baswantagudi, all that is fine, and looking at those books, etc. But while doing medicine and also reading about this, was the thought of Vivekananda and his sayings haunting you so much that yes, at whatever cost, I must spread his message across and take people with me?
I look at my life as one continuum of living Swami Vivekananda's message. So even during medicine, I remember specifically an incident which we call, today I understand in the world of leadership, when I teach, I describe it as a crucible moment. All of us have crucible moments in our lives. Some of us choose to reflect on those crucible moments and make meaning out of it and transcend just the emotion and try to act on it. Many of us don't. And I was privileged to have read Swami Vivekananda and his message at a very young age. So I attribute everything to his way of, his inspirational message. He says, we are the makers of our own destiny. And this was questioned, I was tested in my understanding of this. I just, in 84, the reason for which the organization had to start in 84 was as a young third year student, I just posted to medicine. And in Care Hospital, we have something called the Kantraja Ward. It's an old building, And being in the medical, as a third year student, you're always nobody, and we were under a very big professor, very big name, Professor Jadhav was there.
Yeah, of course.
He was also a terror for many of us.
Kanta's husband.
Yes. Yeah. We're always worried that you will make a mistake in his presence, and then you are the professor, the assistant professor, the lecturer, the final PGs, the final year student, and somewhere down the 24th or 25th man is a third year student. And you are desperately wanting to learn as much as you can when such wonderful people are teaching you. You are always thinking that you shouldn't miss anything. You can't miss a murmur here, you can't miss something there. And so you want, and if you are the 25th person auscultating or percussing, the patient would pretty much slap you because he knows that you are useless, right? He's not even had a mustache. He's not even a doctor. They know that. So you want to be the first guy to pretend to be a doctor. So if clinic start at 8 o'clock, I would go there at 7:30. And pretend, and some patient would innocently think we are doctors, and you proudly carry your stethoscope around your neck, and they show you the ECG. You're not even sure what it means, but you sort of keep it there and look at it, and want to convince the patient you are actually a doctor. And this is how I spent that first 3 months of my clinical postings. And the first month, I still remember a patient was 44-year-old, admitted with hypertension. And he was not responding to treatment. So every morning the rounds happens, in 30 seconds the professors bark out their orders, patient is not responding. And then you realize that such things are even given a name, and people call it idiopathic malignant hypertension. And we are all, at that point I didn't realize that doctors are not allowing themselves to be called idiots, so they call the disease idiopathic. So that's how I look at it even today. And this young man, this not 44-year-old man, was an unmarried cook, a Brahmin cook, and from a village in T. Narsipur. One day I come early in the morning at 7:30, I found the bed empty. And in government hospital, the bed is empty, the cot is empty, he's died the previous night, and the tender bed for fumigation. That is when I noticed a 75-year-old woman crying and packing her little aluminum vessels in a plastic bag, those knitted plastic bags. It was so sad that none of us had even noticed that woman for 1 month of this patient getting treated. So I started talking to her, and I was the first person in a white coat to start talking to her, and she started giving me all the finest expletives and shouting at me and saying, "You killed my son." And I tried to explain to her, no, it's not that way. 1 month the professors tried their best. They kept changing medicines, they kept all the step care regimen we used to read those days in hypertension. They did their best, but your son had malignant hypertension. He was not responding to it. And then she burst out, and what she told me shattered my life. I actually wanted to drop out of medicine then. She said, "What you people gave me were not medicines. What you gave me were pieces of paper every day." This woman, her only son, was unmarried. They had half an acre of land. They had already sold it on his treatment for 2-3 years and come to the government hospital. And he hadn't got a single tablet for a month. All that he was getting were piece of paper on prescriptions. the government system, the public health system had failed him. He had not died of idiopathic malignant hypertension. What he had died was untreated hypertension. And for a moment I felt this is not the profession I want to be in. This is not the medicine I came here for. This is not the service I want to do. If a system is so rotten that we can't even take care of our citizens, maybe I don't fit in here. That's the first thought I had. And my first attempt at charity was also that day, because that woman did not even have the money to take this body home. So I went round, and the third lesson I learned was that the poor understand poverty the best. Equally poor people in the ward gave 2 rupees, 5 rupees, and I put together 80 rupees, I still remember. And I went and got a taxi. And I believe these are signs from the divine to reinforce in me the feeling that if you have the will, God will find you the way. This taxi driver asked me for 200 rupees to take this body. I told him, I said, why do you need so much? He said, 100 rupees for the trip, 100 rupees for servicing the car because I am carrying a body. I simply said, yes, I didn't even realize how I am going to pay. Got him, and as I was putting the body, then after loading the body, I said, I have only 80 rupees with me. But I gave him my hostel room number and said, I am in this government hostel. Every month I will come to your cycle stand, bus stand, and my father used to send me 225 rupees a month. So my mess bill used to be 210, I still remember. I said, I will save 10 rupees every month, 5 rupees I need for myself, I will come and pay you the next 12 months 10 rupees. The taxi driver, he didn't say anything. He took the body. And the next month when I went to give him the 10 rupees, he hugged me, he's an elderly Muslim taxi driver, I still remember, and said, I never thought anybody will do this, but if you could do so much for that unknown person, my share is I don't want the money anymore. So there is so much of goodness in everybody, but we don't know how to tap into that goodness. Yes. And then I realized, Swamiji, when he said man is the maker of his own destiny, I said my destiny in life is to create a movement which will tap into the goodness of every human being I can come across. And we'll only be a platform. It will not be my organization or anybody's organization. It will be a platform through which well-meaning people can do good to society. And that's how it has grown today. We are today considered one of Karnataka's largest NGOs. But I believe it's because it offers space for every decent human being who wants to make this world a better place to associate and express himself to that.
It's really good because, when you say that you got this youth movement, and we know that almost 60% of our population is youth, and we have this youth, the youth of today are the citizens and the policy makers of tomorrow, and change should be the only way forward, because today what happens, and if you look at all the policy makers, they are only looking at what is in it for them. And if we are saying that what's in it for me, and if they come into power, they're looking for the next 5 years as to how they can actually build up their bank balances to fight the next election. So what are they trying to do in this 5 years is a big question mark. So where is the election manifesto? Where is this? These are all cosmetic. So if we are now looking at it and you bring this awakening, like what Swami Vivekananda's sayings actually got across to you, and even 10% of these people are able to sort of spread this, it's almost like a domino effect. And I feel that you must not say that, oh, why only one person? But even that one person is important. And I think it is the quality, not the quantity, that matters, and the persistence. And I have always felt, when you actually talk to people, you never know how many people you are going to influence. And I have found with this masterclass, I have been able to influence so many people. But I did not know when I started that so many people would get influenced. Now, just a small thing, what you've said about getting into the library and you were able to read from an IIT, from an computer science, from a BMS college to an MBBS, and then getting fed up with this and having a person dying. See, this is almost like Gautama Buddha getting into becoming, a complete saint kind of this thing, only because he saw all these visions before him. So I feel you also should look at it from a perspective that you are converting almost those 800 people, and 800 people is a huge number. And I think, the fact that you said it's by invitation is also a very big thing, because people tend to drive these kind of movements to their political gains. And as long as you can keep it on that path. So how do you actually manage to keep it on that path?
I think it's recognizing that you're only an instrument. And it's very difficult, because the human ego being what it is, it's very easy to start feeling, oh, I built an institution, I built hospitals, I built schools, hundreds of people are being inspired by me. I made the same mistake. But then I always believe that Vivekananda has got his own way of waking you up to what he meant and what he wants you to do. I still remember several years ago, I was appointed the head and the professor of the Vivekananda chair of University of Mysore, occupied by very privileged people. Like philosophy department, we had stalwarts like Dr. Radhakrishna, and when they set up a chair and they appoint you, you think you must be good, you must be really great. And I was no different. I think by the time the then Chief Minister of Karnataka, Veerappa Moily, had written my autobiography in Kannada, he called it Kotta. So I thought, oh, I must be really damn good. And slowly that seed of I grows in you. You don't even recognize it. It's a worm which is hidden. And I still remember the first day of my lecture on the Vivekananda chair professorship. The auditorium was full, very impressive, and the lecture was simply brilliant. Everybody came and told me, and some very great literary figures like Sri Prabhu Shankar, a Kannada literary figure. He was also was the first Vivekananda chair. He hugged me and said, when I lectured, I had 6 people listening to me. When you lecture, see 400 people in the auditorium is full. You must be really good. I really felt thrilled. I said, oh, I've done it. I've reached that stage where Vivekananda is now at the end of my tongue. It took me half an hour to realize how stupid and how egoistic I was. So I walked up, then I came back to Mysore. I was living in the forest. Then I came back to Mysore, met the Vice Chancellor and told him, I don't deserve to be the Vivekananda chair, professor. I don't think I may be a good speaker, but I don't think I understand Swamiji. If I can believe that I gave a speech, I have not understood Swami Vivekananda. I said I'm going to resign. And then he told me, appointing a person is very easy, but accepting the resignation of somebody like you and the media would come and criticize us, and it becomes big political news. So please hold on for a couple of months. After that, if you still feel that way, then let's talk about it. But those 2 months, I felt so embarrassed. I traveled to Vivekananda Rock, Kanyakumari. Then from there, I went to Sabarmati. Gandhi and Vivekananda are my icons. Sabarmati is not like what you see today, all well developed. Those days, nobody bothered. It was still unkept for. I spent a couple of days in Sabarmati looking at the mural of Gandhi's march. So in that moment, I said, I think I've forgotten myself. So let me also walk. In a childish way, I challenged my conviction and my faith in Vivekananda and said, if I truly believe in the message that there is God in every human being that Vivekananda says, and my journey is to discover that God in every human being, I'm going to walk. I'm going to walk, again ego took over, and I'm going to walk more than Gandhi. If he walked 360 kilometers, I'm going to walk a little more. So I walked 420 kilometers. So from Sargur, I walked through 5 districts, 200 villages, and I said, I will not take a rupee, I will not ask anybody for food. If there's a place I'll sleep, it could be a temple, it could be somebody's house. If they give me food, I'll eat or I'll fast. I didn't call it starving. And 28 days, 420 kilometers, reached Gandhi statue here. The kind of response people gave me, I suddenly realized the meaning of surrender, the meaning of just saying things get done through you. It's not even you. And then what Vivekananda writes, he says, don't stand on a pedestal and say, here my poor man, take my 5 cents. Consider yourself privileged that you've been given a chance to take care of the poor. One more place he writes, and I thought he wrote it for me. I thought he's written it only for me. He says, all the hospitals you build, all the schools you construct can crumble to dust in one earthquake or can get washed away in one cyclone. So God, who gave birth to the calf, also created the cow to feed it. So don't think you are the doer, but consider yourself privileged that things are getting done through you. So that time, till then I was believing I built hospitals, schools, colleges. That day I realized that those things were built through me. And I think once you start taking the position that you are not the doer, but things get done through you. It is not about you doing the work, but about the work getting done. Then you realize people easily follow you. People come and join you. People join hands with you, because I think the greatest building that you can do of teams is when you subsume your ego and yourself. So I think real leadership is being present by being absent. And if you don't succumb to the media glare that can hit you, and if you're mindful enough to say, that's just there and forget it. If you have the courage to say no to honors that follow you, which some of Vivekananda has given me the courage, whether it's national or state, saying that no, it doesn't belong to me and I will not take it. Somewhere then you start living Swamiji's message. And I think that is what has helped me build a movement today. And hopefully it will carry on beyond me.
Well, I think in a way I tend to agree and not agree with you, because recognition is also a way of saying that people's trust in you is there, and a kind of an accountability from you is going to be expected of you. And when they expect that from you, you must be humble enough to say that this has been an honor by people voluntarily giving this to you, and you should proudly wear that award as long as it's not a bribe and things like this. And then you must go forward, that government has recognized you, people recognize you. It's an insult to the people that you don't take these awards. I believe that you should take these awards and see that these awards are also made to change people's minds. This is one way I look at it. The second thing I also look at is, change is the only thing constant in life, and the best person to change is yourself, because you can't change the world, but the way you look at the world you can change. And if you can change yourself for the better, the way in which you look at a person will also change. The I will become we, and therefore you will say, maybe I thought of this person as wrong. And if you really think, put yourself and say, count 5, why did I scold that person? And then you will find out that there was a reason that that person did not actually do what you thought that person did. But that count to 5, people don't have time. And once you have spoken, you can't take it back. So the power of silence is so important that we have forgotten that silence is also a very powerful language. What do you say?
I completely agree with what you said. In fact, there's a book by Swami Vivekananda called The Power of Silence.
Yes.
Yeah. And Eckhart Tolle's book Stillness Speaks itself is a very powerful expression of that stillness, that silence. So I think silence, one is the external expression of silence, I fully agree with you. There's also an internal expression of silence, because our mind is chattering all the time, and if we can hold back. So I believe that the struggle, at least from my perspective, is that when you're ready to be objective enough to look at the recognitions, awards, rewards, etc. that we get in the kind of work, and you're able to keep that space, that Chitta Pragnate that Bhagavad Gita talks about, that's a time when it doesn't affect you. I personally don't believe I'm there. So the struggle continues. So only when you feel that confidence, I fully agree with what you said, we'll have to be able to immune to all that also and insulate ourselves from that. Maybe it takes time and evolution, and I hope I'll get there some point of time. So till then you say, let me avoid it at least, right? You know you love sweets. So the only way not to eat the sweets is not to buy them. If you buy them and keep it on your table, you're eventually going to say, I'll just eat a little bit, and then you're into it again. So it's an absolute necessity, but it's a necessity from a perspective of growing a philosophy, growing an ideology. So today I do believe, I completely concur with you, and I'm exploring ways in which our work gets known, our philosophical basis gets known. We believe that we got to invest on building human and social capital to build a resurgent India. And this cannot be done by 1 or 2 or 3 people. We need hundreds of people. And the only way these hundreds of people will join you is when society recognizes your ideology and appreciates it. So from that perspective, you're absolutely right. So I only try to depersonalize it. So you can't personalize it.
Yeah, but the thing is that yes, you have an ideology. You start with an ideology. Somewhere along the line, this ideology gets mixed up with some kind of personal intent. And it's so sad that the person who's actually trying to mix it thinks that other people don't know. And it's so, sort of glaring that people know, and you will never have a second chance to make that first impression again. And so when you fall by the wayside, you can't even get up. So I believe that even before creating a movement, you have to sort of tell yourself, am I ready for it? And this is a long haul. You're not going to start today and do it tomorrow. Even pregnancies take 9 months. So, in fact, I tell myself, I mean, are we going to be creating magic, taking a rabbit out of a hat or something like that? It isn't. Because then I had people coming and telling me that a couple crying that they never had a child and they are ostracized in society because she's incomplete, she's a banj and all that. So I just told her, just because you don't have a child, it doesn't make you incomplete. So what if you're not reproductive? You're productive. And I don't want you to be incomplete. You're totally complete. Why does the same thing not apply to the man as well? And children are born through us and not to us. And I believe that this is a journey. It's just that they pass through us. And for a short period of time, we enjoy them. And if that is not possible, we can adopt a child and give that child a life. Because at the end of it, what you need to have is a child brings joy to us. Suppose you have a child that's handicapped just because you have certain diseases. Don't go on saying this is going to be my child and even if it's handicapped, I'll look after it. That is ego. God above looks and says, look, it's not good enough, stop it at this place. But the ego says, no, my own procreation. So this I kind of ego thing, unless you have the right people to sort of push it forward and say that a movement is there that is going through us and not because of me, and this becomes a movement so that there is a plan A, plan B, plan C, because none of us are immortal and it has to just continue. Because even when I saw the AAP party, the way they had come forward, and then suddenly, especially with the Anna movement, I somehow find that somewhere along the line, the whole thing was derailed. Whether it is the press that has actually played a part in it, or whether it is the people that have played a part, the moment they see there is some success in it and what they can get out of it, it gets diverted. And I'm very happy with your association, the Swami Vivekananda Youth Movement, that you are able to keep the flock together and as a result of it, be able to build institutions and colleges and schools in that place, particularly hospitals, in an absolutely tribal area like the Bandipur and the H.D. Kote. It must have been a very difficult task. How did you manage? Because these are the challenges that the public have to know.
Yes, it's a difficult task. But strangely, I just recollect two incidents I want to recollect. One was my own spiritual guide and guru, Swami Achalananji. He had told me something which at a very young age, for 5 years I learnt at his feet, and he told me one thing. He said, you're doing something in the name of a man who stood for nationalistic service, who stood for seeing God in man, Shivajnane Jiva Seva. That is a saying that Ramakrishna gave Vivekananda. And if you do truly believe that your life's mission is to see that God in man, including in yourself and in others, and if you go doing an expression of that seeing God in man is service for you, He will always provide for you. It looked like a very irrational statement for a student of science. Is who is He? How does He provide? We all, 19, 20, 21, you're always looking for answers for which you think you're brilliant in your questions. But what you don't realize is that your questions were stupid and that's why the answers were not there. But as you go deeper in life and experience it, and these are all not answers you can intellectualize, you have to experience it, you have to immerse yourself into that sadhanas and then experience it. And to me, life has been a series of reaffirming instances where I have understood that when you surrender and when you are completely saying that, come what may, I'll face a situation, He is there to take care. So when I have been beaten up, I have been arrested, when you fight for the exploited, when you oppose the government and certain of its policies, you are putting yourself at the mercy of certain situations. But if you trust and if you say, well, I know what I'm doing and I'm doing exactly the way Vivekananda wanted, and there is a force, a power which will help you grow it, you can solve problems. Get solved. I can't explain this. I can only say they get solved. I don't know. I don't think I have solved them, but they get solved. And I know the other instance I can remember, what Swami Achalanji told me. And when I took about it, Swami Vivekananda himself says in one place, he says, what do you need? What do you really need? And his devotees ask him, you keep saying service, service. what do you exactly mean? What can we do? And as a doctor, for many of us, it's very easy to internalize this and say, I'll go serve in rural areas. A lot of young people today ask me, well, it was easy for you, but how do we serve? And I have only what Vivekananda's message was to his devotees at that point of time, and I think for all of us. He says, all you need are 3 H, he says, in his own beautiful way. He says, first is the heart to feel. He says, feel, my children, feel for the poor, the marginalized. And he says, feel till your head reels and your heart stops and you will fall down dead. With that kind of feeling, power will come, he says. And then he doesn't stop there. He says, heart to feel is only the beginning. He says, then the head to think. You got to think through a solution for the problems that you're feeling intensely about. If you feel that 54% of our children are malnourished in this country, if you feel that 78% of our women in rural areas are still suffering from iron deficiency anemia, you'll be angry, you'll be upset, you'll want to do something about it. And then you start rationalizing it and asking yourself, how do I do it? That's the mind to think, head to think. And then he said the hands to work. It has to be your hands. You cannot draw out blueprints and somebody else will come and do it. So when you soak yourself into this sense of feeling, emotion, the motivation for your work, when you start thinking through how to solve this problem, the strategy comes in. And when you start, the hands to work is the action that you do, support comes. Now we all imagine that society is full of absolute crooks, miserable people. It's not true. When they see you fired by this holy inspiration, when they see you putting your hands to work, in strange ways support comes. I have had excellent bureaucrats who support. I wouldn't have gone to H.D. Kote but for a deputy commissioner of Mysore. He took me by his car and he said, if you want to serve people, these are the people who need you, not in and around Mysore where I was working. That's also a man, human being. I've had extraordinary support from politicians, chief ministers. They might be whatever they were in their political life, but they stood by and supported the work. I had support from jurists, from judiciary, Justice M. N. Venkatachalaya, who's been my guide for 30 years, who believed in people like me. So we had extraordinary. So society has got, I still believe, goodness in everybody. So whether it's a 1 rupee or 10 rupees, I still remember an incident. A postman in Bangalore, a small little article about me had come in Prajavani or Deccan Herald, I forget those days, 35 years ago. He was a daily wage postman. Those days he was not even confirmed. He was not a full-time permanent postman.
Like a contract worker.
Exactly. And he would send me every month 35 rupees by money order. And I would send him a receipt. The third month, those days money order, you could write a message also and it will come to you. So third month he said, I want my entire 35 rupees to be used by you for your work and not spent on the receipt and the postage that you send back to me. So send me 1 receipt a year. And for 8 or 10 years, I would get 35 rupees a month. Suddenly it became 80 rupees. And the next month he wrote a message saying, you might be confused why 35 became 80 from this month. I got an increment of 45 rupees and I don't need those 45, so I'm sending the entire thing to you. Now, we can say and dismiss him off as an ordinary postman, but look at his goodness. Unknown person, I never met him. The Banchankri post office is what will be the stamp. He never disclosed himself to me except an address. Till the end, I never went and met him. So there are such extraordinary people. I remember another incident, my own teacher in the first standard. And you forget these people and go away. I went my way and I received a letter, a postcard, suddenly saying, I am your first standard teacher, Mrs. Rajkumari. I want to meet you. Before I die, this is my last wish.